buildings. So you can see, yes, the whistle has sounded. The formal piece of this still hasn't happened though, and that will happen. What we expect now, it could be sometime in the early afternoon before the Taoiseach makes his way to Áras an Uachtaráin for what will be a fairly short conversation, we expect, with the President, and it is at that point that the election is officially on, because it's the President who has the power to dissolve this 32nd Dáil, which has survived a lot longer than many people had anticipated. Indeed, its foundations at the beginning, the foundations of the government created out of this 32nd Dáil were very flimsy indeed, so weak were they. But of course, something changed fundamentally a few weeks in, and that was that decision by the UK to leave the EU. Suddenly those foundations solidified, and in some ways, from that moment on up until very recently, the government and the Dáil really had nowhere else to go until clarity emerged on that point. But then it did. And then too, the numbers and the arithmetic in the Dáil have changed in recent weeks as well, as a result of the by-elections, as a result too of that curious decision by a sitting TD to take up a job in the European Commission, Darragh Murphy, of course, resigning his seat. Suddenly things had changed, the election speculation mounted, and any hopes that this could be kept together for another few months to get legislation passed, well, they were dashed really in the early days of this week.
Yeah, it'll be almost 4 years to the day since the last election. Technically, there's another year left in that mandate, but it has been quite remarkable at all that it has gone this far, Micheál, hasn't it? What issues are they going to slug it out for the 33rd Dáil, do you think?
I think we have already seen the tone of this election set, and that was clearly laid down yesterday. Focus beginning already to zone in on the economy and issues like housing and health. And it is difficult for a government who have been in office, a Fine Gael-led government for 9 years now, when issues like housing and like health come to the fore. And that's a relevant point, because there is a view that issues like that perhaps don't ultimately get to decide elections, that it all comes down to economic management in the end. And that is no doubt what Fine Gael will be hoping for here. Could this be the election that changes things, given the scale of the housing crisis and the scale of the numbers, which of course, the numbers of people homeless, that is, that have increased consistently over the last 4 years of this particular government. That will indeed be a focus of this campaign.
Stay with us, Micheál. I'm going to talk to Sinead Crowley, who's in studio with us. Social media already reacting as this news began to creep out and now has flooded out, if you like, Sinead. What are people saying?
That's right, and you could even see that last night and over the last couple of days on social media, shots of posters and that sort of thing. And clearly this is an election that will be brought to the people by a lot of different means, one of them being social media. And also some announcements out this morning as well. We see that Ivana Bacik has been declared the Director of Elections for the Labour Party. That has just come into our news system here, and also Pierce Doherty for Sinn Féin. So announcements like that happening already. As you say, the election hasn't officially been called. That's the prerogative of the President, and the Taoiseach will have to go to the Dáil, but already announcements in full flight. I see that Minister Helen McEntee as well has been speaking on the Sean O'Rourke programme about the Saturday election. She's the Minister of State for European Affairs, and she has said that the Saturday election isn't unprecedented. Now, most people had been expecting a Friday election. That had been custom and practice, vote on Friday, count on Saturday. She's saying that the Saturday election isn't unprecedented, and she says it means the schools don't have to close, and it means gives students a chance to get home to vote.
We get our fact checkers to see what when the last Saturday election was, or maybe it was in a local election or something. We'll find that out. In terms of choreography today, Sinead, what happens when the Taoiseach does begin making his way to Áras an Uachtaráin?
Well, it is the constitutional role of the President to dissolve the Dáil, and that has to happen officially. So we believe the Taoiseach will speak first of all and then make his way to Áras an Uachtaráin, and that's where really the choreography of state comes into play there. He will arrive. A warrant of dissolution has to be signed, so he has to speak to the President and ask him for this warrant of dissolution. It is expected that this will be granted. It has never happened that it hasn't been granted, so it is expected to be granted. The two men will probably have a short private conversation. It's quite quick what happens today. The choreography of today is quite quick in comparison to what happens when actually a new Dáil is formed. But what's expected to happen is the two men will have a short private conversation. They'll then walk into the State Drawing Room, which is a room we all know well from official visits. A lot of receptions or a lot of photographs will happen there. That's a room we know. They're likely to be accompanied by the Secretary-Generals, both of the Department of the Taoiseach and of the President, that there will be an official signing, shake hands, and that really is it. It does tend to be quite quick, it's a formality, it has to be done, and after that then they may well have a quiet word. After that happens, the Taoiseach leaves, and then really your election is in full.
And then it's game on. These are the formal rules laid out in the Constitution, and it has to be gone through for every single election, or more or less has since the Constitution came into place. But that is the end of the 32nd Dáil once that happens, isn't it?
That's it, and 30 days then after the dissolution of the Dáil, the election must take place within 30 days, but obviously we have a date now, which is the 8th.
And then what happens after that is it has to resume then within a set amount after the election, isn't that right?
It does indeed. There has to, the maximum period of time between the dissolution of the Dáil and the meeting of the new Dáil is 60 days. So you obviously, particularly in the way things have been in recent years with coalition talks and independence and so on, it may not be as straightforward as a large party. So it does allow time there for speaking. But it will be interesting to see with the Saturday vote, with the count on Sunday will presumably go into Monday as well. So it'll be slightly different from other years, but I suppose see what effect turnout as well have given the Saturday vote there too.
Okay, Paul Cunningham, our political correspondent, is in the grounds of Áras an Uachtaráin. Paul, on Taoiseach due there at some stage this morning or mid-afternoon. Do you have any indication of the timescale yet?
Not just yet. I was on to the Áras, and they're saying they haven't been officially informed by government buildings that the Taoiseach is arriving. And on that basis, that's why we're standing out in the rain here, Ray. So we don't actually have a timescale just yet. That will be dictated by the Taoiseach. He will be talking to certain people before he gets into the car. But it's very there's an awful lot of choreography goes into it. So when he leaves through government buildings, because that's always the case, he will come here. And then, as just Sinead professionally explained, by the time they come to the Áras itself, it's a quiet word, quick signing on the book, a couple of pictures, and that's it. He'll be gone. The Taoiseach will not be talking to the media about anything. It's just a picture affair.
Yes, and Sinead was saying that is very much the formal end of things to get the election going proper. As an observer of these issues and political issues, Paul, do you think the Taoiseach has got his timing right now? Once the new year came, it was inevitable that this Dáil seemed to have run out of steam?
It really depends on who you speak to. Some within his own party would have liked to have gone earlier. Maybe, last year around the summertime when they felt that he still had some sheen and he still was sort of the new candidate. They felt that as it dragged on and the Dáil effectively fell apart, then he wasn't going to be seen as leaving on his terms. Others felt that, and I'm talking about Fine Gael, both ministers and also TDs felt that he had a clear agenda, a body of work that he wanted to get done, and that allows him to go to the people and say, look, we have followed through with our priorities. We didn't just throw in the towel when it seemed opportune. We had a body of work to do and we followed it through. So it really depends on how you look at it yourself. From the opposition's point of view, this has been something they've been anticipating. It was pretty clear over the Christmas period that the numbers just simply weren't going to be there. It wasn't going to be possible for Fine Gael, the Independent Alliance, plus independents, plus Fianna Fáil abstaining, plus some other independents who effectively turned the other way and allowed legislation go through. It was just getting too close. And so now we are at the point of no return. The Taoiseach is going to come here. Once that signature is put on the piece of paper, the 32nd Dáil is over, the campaign is on, and while we've been focused on the date now for the past couple of weeks, will he, won't he, will it be the 7th, will it be the 14th, that's all academic. The campaign will be underway and hopefully it'll focus a lot on the question of issues rather than personalities.
And I understand the cabinet meeting is over, he's then going to meet opposition leaders. Is that again a formality, Paul?
And that was something he said that he wanted to do. In his interview with Ortiz this week on Sunday, he sort of effectively laid it out that there was some business he had to do. He had some north-south business, and that related to the reintroduction of the institutions at Stormont. He said there was some Brexit work to be done that also involved having discussions with Boris Johnson. Then he was going to have the cabinet meeting, and then he said that there were a number of formalities, and that would include speaking to the leaders of the opposition. He's not going to sit down with them all, but he will be talking to them, informing them of his intentions, and then once that is concluded, there won't be too much else to do. He'll have cleared the decks. It's then going to government buildings and that famous departure shot where he gets into the car, leaves through government buildings and heads here to Áras an Uachtaráin.
OK, hopefully it won't be too long that you'll be left standing in the rain. Paul, do stay with us if you can, though. Let's go to Cork and Dr. Teresa Reedy of the Department of Government at UCC. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Reedy. First of all, if we just reflect on the 32nd Dáil, were you surprised, as so many have been, that it lasted and for the most part it provided stable government, with many people across the chamber ensuring that that happened?
Yeah, I think the government lasted longer than we had expected when it was formed in 2016. But I think external circumstances were largely contributing to that. The Brexit vote and the protracted nature of the Brexit arrangements and the negotiations then meant that there was a very strong reason for the government to stay in place. And it really wouldn't have suited any of the main parties involved in the arrangements to break it up. So I think it's not because of those kinds of circumstances. It's not entirely surprising that it lasted as long as it did. I think it's also important to say that minority governments are fairly common all across Europe, and in the same way that other countries kind of think of coalition being as inherently unstable for a period of time, we very much had that view about minority government, and I think our experience of the last 4 years will perhaps alert us to the fact that minority governments can work. They can carry out a programme of government, and they can be reasonably stable.
What do you make of this Saturday election? Helen McEntee saying it's not unprecedented. I'm not quite sure. So we'll get our fact checkers on the case there. But what type of an election do you think this will be?
Well, actually, Saturday voting is not unprecedented. We have voted on Saturdays before. Probably most recently, I think the children's rights referendum in 2012 took place on a Saturday. General election voting on a Saturday, though, is fairly unprecedented.
Right, so
and based on the days I have in front of me.
And we have been to the polls in general on Saturday. I suppose that makes sense then, yeah.
Yeah, we definitely have voted before on a Saturday. But actually, on that particular point, one of the big criticisms that they had of the children's rights referendum at the time was the turnout was actually quite low at that referendum relative to other referendums that took place in that particular period. So I think there's definitely an onus to have some kind of campaign alerting voters to the day of the election, the period of time when the polls are going to be open. And that's something that we're generally not very good at doing in Ireland. So I think turnout, given our experience on the last Saturday, I think turnout is something that probably should be a little bit of a concern, and definitely there's a need to do something about that. Yeah,
to highlight, and sometimes students are registered maybe in Dublin where they're living midweek, and there's all sorts of confusions arose at that referendum, if I remember correctly. Do you think this will be a campaign where the two leaders, in particular Mr Martin and Mr Varadkar, will slug it out almost presidential style?
I mean, I think that's certainly going to be the case. I think in general, elections have become more presidential over the last number of decades, and a major reason for that is because of the role that the media plays in elections. So inevitably, there's going to be a lot of focus on these two leaders. They're also the two candidates for Taoiseach, so people will want to hear very much from them, and I expect we'll have live debates between those two people. But there's also the reality that we have multi-party politics in Ireland. So and there's proportionate allocation of election or of airtime once the election is called. So it's very likely that we're going to have to hear from all of the leaders of the other political parties as well. But I think there'll be a lot of emphasis on who will work with who, which parties might be willing to come together to form coalitions in the aftermath of the election. But inevitably, there will be a lot of focus on both Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar. And I think one of the things that did change it quite a little bit since the 2016 election is there's been a movement back towards the two big political parties. The polls are suggesting that they've probably gained maybe 1 or 2% each, and they'll certainly be seeking to increase that, so to kind of consolidate the vote around the centre. If we look at elections, if we go back to the 70s and the 1980s, you would have found that the two big political parties were getting somewhere between 70 and 80% of the vote. That had dropped below 60% the last time. It's quite likely that they'll be seeking to consolidate their role at the core of the party system. And indeed, with that in mind, I think it will probably become a little bit more difficult, say, for smaller parties and independents to get their messages across. But that it was ever thus in election campaigns.
Thank you indeed. Stay with us for the moment. We may come back to you as developments happen. Dr. Kevin Cunningham from TU Dublin is in studio with us now. Thanks indeed for coming in, Kevin. You heard what Theresa was alluding to there, kind of the type of elections we have, the electoral system. It's not quite in the UK where Boris Johnson needed a relatively tiny percentage to get a huge amount of votes, is it?
Yeah, as it stands with the two parties at around 25, 27%, depending on which party, a lot is required for a significant change of the developments. I mean, as it stands, we currently have, obviously, a confidence supply arrangement. To change that, for one of the parties to get into a majority, they need to get up towards 40%.
Yeah, and it's unusual in our system, isn't it?
Well, I mean, historically speaking, it was actually quite normal for parties to be up there. But in this current situation...
Quite splintered now, aren't
it looks very unlikely to get to that situation. It might be the case that one of the parties might get up towards 60 or 65 seats.
Yeah.
That requires Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to get up to 33% in the poll. So that requires a bit of a jump, basically, for one of those two parties to get up to. At that point, they could potentially go in with perhaps the Greens or the Labour Party, or both probably would be more likely. But at that, the party does need to get up to that particular figure.
I mean, the difficulty the last time was that they were almost neck and neck. They've ended up more or less neck and neck. Yeah. It is surprising for people who look at Dáil numbers that didn't happen sooner. But someone getting 60, 65 is, for the Irish system, going to be pretty clear-cut if that were to happen, isn't it? It'll certainly give them a stronger mandate to build a coalition.
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. Certainly in the last election, Fianna Fáil rose by about 5% during the campaign.
Yeah.
Fine Gael kind of fell during that campaign. Certainly, if you look at the recent referendums and the presidential election, the exit polls in those contexts showed that Fine Gael were up there. You know, in terms of their brand is actually quite popular.
Yeah.
In terms of the local elections, on the other hand, Fianna Fáil have typically done a lot better. I mean, Fianna Fáil beat Fine Gael in the locals, and indeed beat Fine Gael in the locals in the 2014 prior to the last election. So locally, Fianna Fáil might look like that they might be able to gather a decent amount of support, but Fine Gael have that brand thing where they could actually rise up to 33, 34% and actually change things a little bit.
What sort of an election do you think this will be?
It's very difficult to tell. This is obviously Leo Varadkar's first election. The debates...
Micheál Martin's third, I think, as leader.
Micheál Martin's third as leader, and suggests that he will continue even if Fianna Fáil doesn't win. It's really looking into a crystal ball to try to understand what type of an election it's going to be. Whether it's going to be a big head-to-head is uncertain. Obviously, the two parties are getting a lot more focus than they might have in the more recent elections, but they're still on, you know, around half of the vote. So half of the public are voting for other parties, for smaller parties and independents. What we do know is going to happen is that the Green Party is going to do better and independents are going to do worse. That seems clear, really, at this point. It is unclear between the larger parties who's going to take off, who's going to galvanise public
opinion. And the smaller
opinion.
parties on the left?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the smaller parties on the left fared relatively poorly in the local elections. But, and
in 2016, of course, there was the anger about water charges was still residual, etc.
Things have moved on a little bit.
Yeah.
Certainly, these areas have not turned out to the same extent, unless...
There'll be different issues this time, won't there?
Well, I mean, certainly the by-elections revealed that if Sinn Féin can actually turn out its vote, it can actually do relatively well. But if it can't, it really does struggle. There is a bit of hope for, say, the Green Party and the Labour Party in terms of the by-elections. When they look at those by-elections, on a projected national swing, they got around 10 or 11% basically between the two of them. So they look to those elections and see that they did well there. But Fine Gael did just as well there that they did in the previous election. So they might expect to improve as well there.
A lot to play for. Speaking of the Labour Party, the leader of the Labour Party, Deputy Brendan Howlin, is now standing by for Southside Leinster House. Well, the election is here, Deputy Howlin. I don't need to remind you how difficult the last election was for Labour. How will this one be?
Infinitely better, I'm absolutely confident. We've already obviously been out on the doors for some time. As the last speaker has just said, we've come from a very good performance in the four by-elections where we averaged 14% across a variety of constituencies from Dublin, Leinster into Cork and Munster. And I think that in the constituencies that were competitive, and it won't be every constituency, we're going to have a very good result. What people are telling us on the doors is people are annoyed with the waste of money from Fine Gael. Billions of their money being wasted when there's a crying need for investment in nurses, in mental health, in solving our homeless crisis, because it's not rocket science. Build more homes. Local authorities have done that for generations. That's the Labour Party way. We support public services, and I think there is a ready ear to hear that message now. Yes,
and as you know well from your time in Department of Finance, there was a very difficult period from 2011 to 2016, and the government, of course, are arguing that it's only in recent years that they're balancing the books, and they presumably will be saying to the electorate, we have the money now, we're going to do all of these things, and they will be hoping as incumbents that message will succeed, will they not?
Well, it is true that our time in government was characterised by the collapse of the economy, brought on by bad policies pursued by Fianna Fáil. But In the last 3 years, that situation has changed. We left a balanced budget virtually, a deficit of less than 1%. We could have addressed and solved those problems in the last 3 years. But it is the view of Fine Gael, and I think of Fianna Fáil, to leave it to the public sector. The Fianna Fáil view of encouraging private medicine and closing down public hospital beds, we haven't recovered from that, and that's why we have a crisis in our hospitals. And the Fine Gael attitude of depending on the private sector to solve the housing crisis means it'll never be solved. We need to go back to the tried and tested Labour policies of local authorities building local authority houses for people and ensuring that the market is plentifully supplied with affordable houses for people who have always been able to afford mortgages. That situation doesn't exist right now, and we can put it right.
Sounds like you're ready to go back into government, Deputy Howlin. Who would you coalesce with?
Well, I mean, my policy platform is simply to put forward the views of Labour. We will be setting out our 5 key strategic areas. I've talked about health, I've talked about housing, climate change, and using the public sector as the instruments for bringing about a change of direction in bringing about a decarbonised Ireland. Also the area of childcare. And the area of work, protecting vulnerable people at work. These are the issues we'll be bringing to the doorsteps, and I think that will be the test for us after the election. If we have critical mass, and that'll be a matter for the people in the next 3 weeks to decide, but if they give Labour a critical mass in the next Dáil, we will determine support for a government either within or without the government from the opposition benches on the basis of who will implement those absolute change policies that will help working people.
There's a changing of the guard going on in your party and in a lot of the other parties, some people stepping down, not going for re-election. Will you have the candidates to put that message to the people?
Yeah, we've a whole array of new, exciting candidates, some of whom were elected in the last local elections. So it will be, I suppose, a balance of experience, which is needed, obviously, but youth and vitality as well. So I think we have an exciting range of candidates right across the country, and I think we're going to have a surprising result for people. I think there will be a very strong double-digit number of Labour deputies in the 33rd Dáil.
OK, and no doubt we'll be speaking to you and maybe perhaps some of those candidates in the weeks
Looking
ahead.
Forward to it.
Thanks indeed for speaking to us this evening. Let's go back to Cork and Dr Theresa Reedy, who's there, the Department of Government at UCC. Dr Reedy, I don't know if you were listening to Brendan Howell and some of our other contributors there. I suppose one thing people seem to be saying is that they all want a stronger mandate. That one thing they don't want is the same kind of splintered Dáil that we have, even though it did last, as we say, for 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, the fragmentation, it does make it difficult to get things done. I mean, so we did have a government that lasted for 4 years, but I don't think any political party would want to be in a minority government arrangement because it really does hamstring their capacity to get things done. And there's a constant need to create rolling coalitions around different political issues and around different policies to get them through the Dáil. And then, of course, there are clearly unpopular topics that nobody wants to go near. And over a period of time, because our system isn't terribly familiar with minority government, we will actually get a big backlog of material starting to build up. That being said, all of the polls are telling us that the fragmented party landscape is still there. There might be some movement towards Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but nothing that would suggest to us that either of those would be capable of forming, say, a two-party coalition, which is what we've typically had in the past. If one or the other of the two big political parties was to have a good day and maybe head towards 50 or 60 seats, we could see them forming a reasonably large coalition government. And I think that's where the parties of the centre-left are really going to come into play. There's a very strong sense that there's momentum behind the Green Party. There's expectations that they could reach maybe 8 to 10 seats. The Labour Party did actually quite well, and I think sometimes actually coverage of the Green Party has meant that the Labour Party hasn't gotten the attention that perhaps some of its results merited. It did quite well in some of the by-elections in November, just before Christmas, and it also had a reasonably strong showing in the local elections. So it's got councillors in places now, like for example here in Cork City, that it didn't in the previous term. So it does have people on the ground and is going into this election in slightly better shape. So I think if the Labour Party uptick was to be reasonable, and you had a strong showing for the Greens, and then kind of one or the other of the big political parties, you might have have the possibility of putting together, albeit a minority government, but a minority government with kind of much greater numbers and perhaps greater coherence and a greater ability to get a programme through the Dáil. But it would still be relying on the other party, if you want, to facilitate that arrangement. But we have seen that before. I mean, we saw that in the Dáil strategy in the 1980s. We've had the more recent experience with it. So, one of the things that we can say about the Irish party system and government formation talks is that they tend to be fairly fluid and fairly flexible, and that has actually stood us in good stead because we've always been able to get governments reasonably quickly after elections.
OK, thank you for that for the moment, Theresa Reedy. We're going to take a break there now. If you're just joining us, the Taoiseach is to call the general election today. It's for February the 8th. He will at some stage in the next hour and a half or so go to Áras an Uachtaráin and ask President Higgins to dissolve the 32nd Dáil, and then it's game on for election 2020. We've more political guests and we've more experts to speak to in a few moments. Join us then. Welcome back to our news special on the day that Taoiseach Leo Varadkar is expected within the hour and a half or so early afternoon to call election 2020 and dissolve the 32nd Dáil with the permission of the President. Still with us in studio, Dr Kevin Cunningham of TU Dublin and our own Sinead Crowley. Sinead, can you bring us up to date with some of the timings and the choreography as it looks like that's happening today?
We do now have a notice in from Áras an Uachtaráin to officially confirm that this dissolution will happen and will be requested. So what we're told is that Taoiseach Leo Varadkar will be visiting Áras an Uachtaráin this afternoon to ask President Michael D Higgins to dissolve the 32nd Dáil and to summon the new Dáil on the 20th of February 2020. So they're the dates we have now. And we're also told that the media are asked to be there at around 1:30. So we can assume by that that formal dissolution or the formal request won't take place until after 1:30. Obviously, the Taoiseach still has to speak here. He still has to make his way to Áras an Uachtaráin. So it's looking like that's the choreography, that it could be after 1:30 before the actual formalities take place. And it's not until then that the election is really underway.
And then it's game on, Dr Cunningham, right?
Game on. The election, as it's proposed, is going to be on a Saturday, which is very, very unusual. I wonder what impact that's going to have in terms of the types of people that normally vote. If you imagine, we have quite unusually elections on a Friday night when lots of people in Ireland obviously like a few drinks. But on a Saturday, it could change the composition of the types of people voting.
It can conjure up its own difficulties indeed. We've got David Cullinan, Sinn Féin TD, ready to speak to us now outside Leinster House as well. Deputy Cullinan, thanks indeed. As we were saying, hour and a half or so to go, then it is officially game on, but I suppose you guys are ready to go to the people in election 2020 right now.
Absolutely, Ray, it is game on. Sinn Féin is going into this election campaign in full confidence. We obviously want to increase the number of TDs that we have. We want the strongest possible mandate for Sinn Féin. We don't believe that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are going to solve the big problems and the challenges that face many families. If you look right across society, we have people who are paying sky-high rents, not just in Dublin but across the state. We have people who need affordable homes, people who want to buy their own homes but don't have the opportunity to do so because both of those parties have failed to build the homes that people need. We've had record numbers of people in hospital trolleys and people waiting for hospital treatment, and what we need are parties in government who are committed to public services and parties who want to transform our public services to ensure that people have a decent life and a decent outcome.
And they will argue, of course, that they have got the economy back on track. It took a long time from a massive crash, and they are starting to do that now. Is that not fair enough from their point of view?
Listen, Ray, this government has been in government for 9.5 years. And since the foundation of the state, we've had governments led by Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. And the reality is that there are many, many people watching this programme, as I said, who are paying very high rents, many people in low-paid jobs, many people who can't afford the cost of childcare. We need to give workers and families a break. That's what they need. And Sinn Féin will have very ambitious policies. We want to deliver the most ambitious public housing and affordable housing programme the state has ever seen because people need it. People need to see a reduction in the cost of childcare. We need to take patients off hospital trolleys and put them into beds. That won't happen if you have Conservative parties who want to cut taxes for the wealthy and for the elites and the top earners. What we need is a party which is genuinely committed over the next, not just 5 years, Ray, but the next 10 years to transform public services and to make sure that the people of this state and this island have decent opportunities. We also have to plan for a united Ireland. I'm a United Irelander. I want to see a white paper on Irish unity. I want to see an all-party Oireachtas committee on Irish unity. I want to see the building foundations of Irish unity put in place. But I also want to see a socially and economically just island, and that's the platform on which Sinn Féin will contest this election.
I think we got a flavour of your manifesto there. Good luck running around the houses and knocking on doors in the next few weeks. Deputy Cullinan, thanks indeed for joining us in Leinster House. Well, Kevin, clearly Sinn Féin, we were speaking about some of the parties on the left. Sinn Féin have a difficulty in that the big two have said they won't go into government with them or have them in government.
The big two, you're absolutely right. One of the interesting things is if Fianna Fáil get a certain number of votes and beat Fine Gael, but not by enough, it might be the case that the only viable government is actually a Fianna Fáil Sinn Féin government, which has been, resoundingly, for obvious reasons, ruled out by Fianna Fáil. But it might be the case that that might actually be the only thing which the numbers actually add up to, unless Fine Gael are willing to step outside and do what Fianna Fáil did for them for this government. So they're kind of in the picture. It just depends on whether that narrative kind of starts to get played. Yes, indeed, and depending how the votes fall and the seats fall and what people decide after the election day, of course. Let's speak to Roisin Shortall, Deputy Roisin Shortall of the Social Democrats. Deputy Shortall, thanks indeed for joining us from our Leinster House studio. What will be the priorities for you as it appears this election is now about to get underway?
Good morning, Ray. First of all, I very much welcome the calling of the election, and let's hope that this will be the end of the shadow boxing between Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar, and that we move on now to look at the issues and look at the various solutions being put forward from different parties and consider how realistic or otherwise those solutions are, because we do need solutions to a lot of the very big issues facing the country. Clearly, the major failures of this government are the whole housing crisis and what's happening in the area of health. And those two areas are impacting enormously on people's lives. And, whether you're on a hospital waiting list, whether you're trying to get your child seen by a speech and language therapist at community level, or whether you're in a situation where you're spending more than half your income on rent and have no prospect of ever being able to own a house. I mean, all of those issues are having a hugely negative impact on people. And that's why we need a new direction. We need to now start considering, how can we do things better in this country? And people deserve better than what they've been getting over the last number of years. And, this isn't rocket science. It's about putting the needs of people first. It's about ensuring that people have a decent quality of life, that the cost of living is actually affordable, that people aren't living to work only, that families in particular, can achieve a better work-life balance so that they've a better quality of life, they've more time to spend with their children, they're not under pressure all of the time, because too many people feel like that. They're getting up early in the morning and coming home late at night. So we need to make time for children, we need to make time for families, and we need to make sure that everybody shares in the recovery that is coming. So, that's a key area. But the other area, of course, is in relation to trust. Trust is a very important thing in politics, and it's important that people are able to believe what politicians are saying to them. And sadly, too often that has not been the case. People say something before the election, and then after the election they do something different, or in government they do something different. So honesty in politics is a really important thing, and we need to restore confidence in politics and how we actually organise our institutions and how the public service operates and all of that kind of area. We need proper governance, and people want to feel proud of their country, but unfortunately they don't necessarily feel like that because of various failures over recent years.
Yes, and indeed it sounds like what you're saying, some of our other commentators have been saying, is that if nothing else, maybe there'll be a more clear-cut result in this election once election day comes. Roisin Shortall, thanks indeed for speaking to us on behalf of the Social Democrats there at our Leinster House studio. Paul Cunningham is our political correspondent. He's still at Áras na Uachtaráin. I see you're still outside in the rain, Paul. They haven't let you in quite yet. Bring us up to date.
It seems as if the media is going to be allowed into Áras na Uachtaráin around 1:30 this afternoon, with the expectation that the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar will arrive here at 2 p.m. to seek a dissolution of the 32nd Dáil from the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. That will be the last of the formalities. After that, general election 2020 gets underway in earnest.
Very good, Paul. We'll wait and see what happens later on. If you're just joining us, the general election is going to be called for Saturday, February the 8th. The election campaign is more or less now underway, and the Taoiseach is expected to make his way to Áras na Uachtaráin, as Paul was telling us there, at around 2 o'clock, where he'll ask the President to officially dissolve the 32nd Dáil. The new Dáil will be summoned on February 20th. Earlier, the Cabinet was informed of the election date. They met. That meeting is now over. The Taoiseach will be meeting other party leaders before he then goes to the Áras to formally sound the starting pistol, and election 2020 is on. We will bring you all of the updates and the developments as they come here on RTE1. Thanks to all of my various guests and all of our contributors this morning. For now, goodbye.